Exciting news, everyone. My new book, I Wish I'd Quit Sooner, is officially out now. You can grab it on all major book retailers and online distributors, and the audiobook is also available on all the popular listening apps. Visit drlaura.live or check the link in the show notes to get your copy today. Hello, everybody. Welcome to another episode of Where Work Meets Life. I'm Dr. Laura, and I'm really excited today to be bringing an episode about why toxic bosses stay while the good leaders are fired. Yes, that is happening, and it's happening way too often. And I have two amazing thought leaders here today. I have Paul McCarthy, best-selling author of The Fired Leader. So I will hold up his book for those of you on YouTube. The Fired Leader, and he also is reinventing the future of leadership as a speaker and thought leader. And then we have Dr. Markus Zehentner, and I know I'm not the greatest at your last name, but Markus has written a beautiful book called Breaking Free from Toxic Leadership. I'm holding that book up, and he is a survivor of toxic leadership himself, a legal professional, and of course, an author. He lives in Vienna, so he's joining us from Vienna today. A little bit more about Markus. He holds a doctorate in law. He brings a strong foundation of professional research, critical thinking, and a deeply rooted sense of justice, which led him to really want to get this book out there and talk about this topic in the world to help others who might be navigating toxic leadership, because this led to a deeply personal family health crisis for Markus, which he will be speaking about today. And then we have Dr. Paul McCarthy. Paul is an author and global thought leader, and he's all about reinventing and reimagining the future of leadership, a better future of leadership. And him and I were introduced serendipitously, and now we're collaborating on this topic and on getting it into the world to help organizations more. Paul brings 25 years of management and leadership consulting across 100 organizations in 10 different industry sectors, so has a lot of experience to bring to the table. So I want to know a little bit more about each of you. So starting with Markus, anything else you want to share about yourself?
I think it's sort of interesting the way I got into toxic leadership, because it has never really been an issue for me, but somehow toxic leadership found me like 4 years ago, when I suddenly found myself reporting to a new leader that turned out to be highly toxic and manipulative. And in my book, I tell a lot of stories that happened to me in that regard, and I call that toxic boss Ethan back then. And Ethan used a wide range of manipulative tactics on me, so he could eventually present me to his superiors as a so-called low performer, because that was a thing at the time, that you identify low performers that would then get less of a bonus. And so what made it really painful for me back then was that this boss deliberately exploited a serious medical crisis within the family. And you want me to go on, like, with how it then actually turned out that I wrote the book?
Maybe I'll just ask a little bit more about this. So you had a medical crisis in your family, and this toxic boss exploited that situation?
My son had just been diagnosed with epilepsy, a severe form of infantile epilepsy, and I also, because of a reorganization, I was moved to a new division, and hence I had a new boss, and that was all a bit much. And I made the mistake that I would not make again, that I was talking a little bit too openly, too honestly, with my then new boss, and so I gave away some weak spots of mine, or that I was struggling at the moment with. My own abilities and motivation a little bit, and because there was just a lot going on. And the interesting thing is, because my boss was not only a lawyer but also a psychologist, and he had a lot of knowledge actually about how to lead, but that also meant that he exactly knew how to motivate me in the first place. And only later I found out that actually there was just a house of cards that he was building up, and at the end of the day, that house collapsed, and it turned out that he uh, actually, through micromanaging me and through exploiting my guilt and through emotional blackmail and everything, he actually totally broke me so that I did not. I felt like an intern then at the time, and not that like that senior lawyer that I used to be. And well, then one day he broke the news to me and told me basically that after 20 years of working in the company, uh, that I'm not a good employee anymore. And that's when it then started. I had a lot of self-doubt then, and constant stress, sleep problems, anxiety, and eventually that all turned into a complete emotional exhaustion and burnout.
Wow, I'm so sorry you went through all of that, and it just goes to show that someone with that much experience, who's really bright in their career and doing well, can be just demoralized by this sort of manipulative, toxic type of boss. And but it led to, in the end, you've recovered, and your book is out in the world. And you wrote this book as part of helping others. Is that right?
Exactly. Well, the recovery process was very wholesome for me. And at some point, I mean, I had to go through therapy. I was on long sick leave. But at some point, I thought I want to develop some kind of personal toolkit for myself, that if I ever get into a situation like this again, I know exactly what to do. And then the more I researched and started writing, I thought, well, why should that toolkit only help me if also other people could sure benefit from it? And that was basically the moment where the idea was born to write Breaking Free from Toxic Leadership. And 1 year later, with the help also of this psychotherapist and organizational psychologist Claudia Schwinghammer, who is my co-author, like 1 year later, we published the book. And that was for me also, from a psychological and therapeutical view, I think very important to turn the whole thing that happened to me, that was really a bad time for me, my family, that I turned that into something good, something that, I mean, I'm an author of a book now that is not about law, and people are even reading it, and I assume the book is helping others. So I would say it was worth it.
I think that's a strong assumption. So thank you for putting that out into the world now. What about you, Paul? Tell us a bit more about yourself and why you focused on the fired leader topic.
Well, thank you. And Marcus, thank you for outlining your experience there at the high level in this context. Because, as you were speaking, one of the things just going through my head was a vision a mission I put together years ago, back in 2019, which was to rid the world of toxic leaders, one leader at a time. And my story is very public, so if everybody knows the platform I've built and am building from the work that I'm doing, and it did stem from toxic leadership, and so if I kind of fast forward to where I'm at now, I'm I'm kind of amplifying this conversation at global levels, systemically looking at dysfunction and institutional ineffectiveness across organizations globally, because toxicity does not discriminate by sector, organizational size, type of leader. It's a free for all. And just hearing your story, the individual, it's very touching actually, because I focused most of my 8 years in this area looking at the systemic, the broader, the bigger conversation to change institutions and systems and processes and mindsets. So it's very humbling when I'm reminded of the impact of this work at the individual level. So thank you for sharing your story there. Um, my situation is a little bit different than yours, in the sense that I I was fired for demonstrating leadership qualities that I was hired for. And just like the title of this podcast, where we talk about why toxic bosses stay while good leaders get fired, what I was doing was I was highlighting, without knowing it, the dysfunction and toxicity, Laura, in the organizations that I was working in. And because I exposed the hypocrisy of leadership and the dysfunction and ego-based leadership and all sorts of political game playing and jockeying, I wasn't popular. And so my lack of popularity for being honest and being real got me my wrist slapped, and I was kind of exited from organizations. And the irony of this is that my experience as a consultant is developing leaders and capacity and capability and competency in all manner of Fortune 500 and other types of organizations. So I started to question whether or not we were firing the very leaders with the leadership qualities that we would need to navigate ongoing disruption. So my experience was the platform, like yours, Marcus. It was the platform for a conversation bigger than me, and that conversation has mushroomed because through the 8 years I've been involved in this and different parts of this, I've uncovered the fact that at the global level, there's toxicity in organizational and leadership cultures that no one's talking about. In fact, we've normalized it. And along comes a leader with leadership qualities like me, that I then look at the research to think about what we need for the future and are we preparing our leaders for that future? And I realized through the research and the data, we're not. So there's almost a double whammy with my story. My story was started because of toxic leadership, and it was the platform that then allowed me to have this conversation at scale with organizations that are now starting to shift the way they think. And there's a lot more to do. But yeah, my story, just for the audience, just a caveat that I wanted to be the leader who fitted in. I wanted to be the leader. I had the corner office, I had all the trappings, and I was living and working and leading in a world where we had normalized dysfunction. We had normalized toxicity. And I didn't even realize it until I started being the kind of leader I am and stepped on all these landmines and then realized, oh, I'm exposing a lot of the fabric of the organization here. And that got me into trouble. And I have to say, from my own experience, being fired 4 times is probably the best thing that's ever happened to me. So I kind of listened to your story, Marcus, and I am genuinely touched by it. And I listened to my story, and we've taken different approaches to addressing something that it's our experience that has enabled us to have these conversations. And I think we're doing the right thing by impacting the world in the ways that we are. So yeah, that's a little bit about my story, Laura.
Thank you for that, Paul. And I know both of your stories, and what ties the common thread of your stories is that you've both been through these lived experiences, which really come through in your books. But your books are both really evidence based as well, which draws me to you as well. And my books, same thing. Mine, I Wish I'd Quit Sooner: Practical Strategies for Navigating and Escaping a Toxic Boss. It includes a couple of my own toxic boss stories. I survived a couple of toxic bosses myself, and I've been an entrepreneur most of my career. So, I mean, they're out there, and even when you're confident and educated and experienced, they can get under your skin and they can affect your mental health and ultimately your physical health if you end up staying too long, which is why I'm all about getting out of there, getting free, exiting toxic leadership, or exiting a toxic boss, or breaking free, like Marcus says. So I want to talk about trends, if that's okay with you. When it comes to the leadership challenges, if we look at leadership as a whole, I want to, first, I'm just going to ask you, Paul, just trends that you're seeing, and let's get you to focus on North America in particular. And Marcus, then I'm going to ask Marcus about trends he might be seeing in Europe.
Yeah, happy to. And some of my research and trends may bleed into the rest of the world as well, because there are some commonalities. But what particularly when I started this path 8 years ago, I cited the now infamous Gallup research about the state of global disengagement at that time, and the cost of it was $7 trillion every year. And since I've been doing this work, that cost has now gone up to 8.9 trillion a year. And so the irony is that we're seeing more than ever initiatives and schemes and projects and ways in which we want to be we want to be transparent as organizational cultures. We want to invite people to be themselves in an organization. We're doing more now than we've ever done to be inclusive with the way that on the surface, with the way that we organize, design, and work with talent. And yet the true impact and cost of disengagement and toxicity is rising. So I'm looking at this and I'm thinking there's a bit of an incongruence, because we're doing more than ever, but we're still not getting the results. In fact, the numbers are going further up. Just before I was getting ready for this conversation, I just looked at some research just to refamiliarize myself with the state of play. And this was pre-COVID, 2019. The cost in the US alone in the last 5 years, and this is according to SHRM, Society of Human Resource Management, the cost of toxicity is $223 billion every year, right? So that's a big number. Then you think about stuff from HBR. Most of their work on this, the research on this, is North America. 50% of the workforce are seeking new opportunities right now. And the reason they're seeking new opportunities is because their relationship with their immediate supervisor is toxic. Now cross-reference that to work out of Leader Factor and Dr. Timothy Clark, who on one webinar showed that 90% of toxic bosses cannot be coached, right? So what do you do with them? How do you remove them from the organization? And then 87% of the people on that webinar that I was on a few years ago talked about having experience of toxic workplaces. So this is real. This isn't a trend. We have baked in to the very DNA of our organizations and our approaches to leadership a normalization of things that shouldn't be happening, but they are. Let me give you some practical examples. They happen to me, and they no doubt happen to Markus and to you and many people that listen to this. And I talk about this in my book, so I sometimes feel like a broken record when I do keynotes and workshops on it. But there's a meeting before the meeting, and you're not invited, right? Or because you didn't turn up at the partner's, birthday party or end of year celebration for the office, you're now passed over for that promotion. Or in fact, you don't get that new project that you were earmarked for by the resource manager. I know this because I've worked in management consulting for almost 30 years, and I've seen this with other people, including myself. Those are very slight nuances of toxicity, and they build up over time, and we've compounded them and we've normalized them to such an extent that we have jokes like, "Hey, Laura, are you going to the partner's party next week? You better go, because if you don't, you might not get that promotion." We've enshrined in our lexicon the very acceptance of toxicity. And so the research is speaking for itself, right? And recent research coming out of EY, which is ironic because companies like that are also, they've got their own journey with toxicity. But their research showed that 92% of people would not join or stay at an organization if their purpose did not align with the organization's purpose. So people are waking up. We're starting to become more clear around what we want to move towards in terms of the organizations that we want to join and stay at. But the numbers are still very disheartening, Laura. That's just the surface level. I could go a lot deeper. I don't know if we've got the time, but I wrote an ebook on this, and I can make that ebook available to people if they want. But this is the tip of the iceberg.
So we will put that ebook in the show notes. If you're able to send that to me, we'll include it as part of this episode. And so lots of trends. And that's the reason I'm putting out my book's already out, is because this topic is getting worse. I've seen it get worse since the pandemic, and your data is showing that as well. So thank you, Paul. And Markus, what are you seeing? Are you seeing the similar trends happening in Europe?
Fortunately, there seems to be a lot of similarities, and Paul, you totally spoke from my heart and also from what I experienced. So, especially even your story, being hired 4 times because of certain leader skills that you had, and then being fired 4 times because of these leader skills. That aligns pretty much with an observation that I make in Europe. I see an increased appreciation of mental health, of work-life balance or work-life wellness, of flexible work models. But when it comes to large organizations, these commitments often turn out to be more of a facade. So like they hire you for your awesome skills, but then they find out, well, actually these skills don't really fit our work culture or what we actually want, and they fire you again. So what I see, for example, also is that organizations would do psychosocial evaluations of the company, and even if the outcome is then really bad, that would not really lead to structural changes or better recruitment and promotion processes. And then another thing, all these official or burnout prevention measures, they are usually designed as an employee obligation rather than a task for the management to create a work environment that does not lead to burnout in the first place. So what I see at the end of the day is more awareness on the surface, but unfortunately, no decrease in number of toxic leaders and probably even an increase. And I'm coming to an end now, but two more little things. I think that employees also feel even more pressure now because now they have to squeeze in to their busy schedules also the self-care time, because if they don't and they get a burnout, then it's their fault basically. And then we also have that huge gap between superficial awareness and actual work culture, and that can sure lead to increased frustration.
Well, yes, and you made a good point. You called it psychosocial evaluations. I call it surveys and engagement data and climate data. And an organization that collects that data and doesn't do anything about it is worse off than if they had not collected that data. It's better not to, right?
Yeah, because then you're like, okay, the data is out, but when do we actually get the results? It can take a long time, and then there are results, but what is going to be done about it? And well, in many times, not really changes. Then that's what I hear.
I was just going to just throw a little bit more data in there for people that might be listening to this and are looking at this purely through the financial lens, Laura. So purely that the actual cost, the financial cost of toxicity, toxic leadership, not just like the state of toxicity according to like the 223 billion, but at an individual leader level. All right. So the trends of all that data are showing morale's dipping, turnovers on the rise, productivity's lowering, and people aren't talking about that. They're leaving. And so when they leave, if you're a leader, my figures are referenceable to leaders, but there's research that shows for non-leaders and supervisors and frontline staff as well, purely for leaders that leave an organization for any one of those reasons that we've been talking about, the cost to replace them, the direct financial cost, is between 213 and 400% of their base salary. Now you start adding on other financial costs like medical, pension. Now you look at the non-direct financial costs. So the effect on the alumni, right? So you leave an organization and you might have had 10 clients that are under your purview. Well, we know that good people go after people, right? So those companies are going to want to follow that leader at some point. You risk the alumni strategy for your organization. What about the people you leave behind? Your teammates, your colleagues, your peers, the effect on their morale, the effect on their productivity, the effect on potential turnover with them. And so it snowballs. And in my book, I actually use this as a business case to show people at C-suite and executive and board level that the cost of toxic leadership and allowing it and people leaving the organization is into the billions, and like this is a regular occurrence. So if you just do the math, and I've got all sorts of things that I talk with people about, but I just wanted to highlight that because we're coming at this from an angle that's like almost the ethical and the moral, and that's great, right? We need to redesign organizations and structures, in ways that are fitting for what future generations of leaders want and need, great. There's not going to be there's going to be a sizable chunk of people listening to this that aren't motivated by the moral and the ethical, but they're motivated by the financial. So if you do nothing else but just look at the finances of this is another pandemic, because this is going to ruin economies, and people underestimate that, but it's growing. And so I mix my language up depending on who I'm speaking with, because some people want the business case in the financial dollars and cents. I'll give it to you. Like, it's not going away unless you address it. So just wanted to drop that in there.
Thank you for sharing that. So, really interesting discussion about the broader trends that are going on and the financial, the business impact, the culture impact. Let's talk about the impact of bad or toxic leaders on the individual. I just want to ask Markus this question because you went through it yourself. What were some of the impacts that you went through and that you talk about in your book? And then I'll chime in with more from mine.
May I just add one sentence to what Paul just said, because I can't keep it back. I so much agree. And this is something like the financial costs. They're referred to as the hidden costs of toxic leadership, but as we see, they're not so hidden. And I really honestly don't get it. All companies are all about saving, letting people go, cutting benefits because they need to save money. And then there are these huge numbers and they are being ignored. I'm still have to find a reason to process that, why that can be. And I think that's a huge thing one has to work on. Thank you for that, Paul. So your question was what the impact on toxic leadership was on me and what I learned from this, right?
Yes.
First, as we discussed earlier, I fell into a big mental health crisis. I had self-doubt, anxiety, I had a burnout, and I also had, and that was terrible, like, that kind of stuff sucks out all the energy, all the positive energy from you, be it at work, but then also when you're at home surrounded by a family, which is the most painful part of it all. And yeah, but then during my recovery, I learned a few things that I'm very glad and thankful actually that I got the chance to learn at the end of the day. Maybe four highlights. First, I learned how to identify toxic leadership, like what are the first indicators that you might be dealing with a toxic leader, and also what are actual manipulation tactics, what do they look like? And secondly, I learned what tools you can use, and that was like a big purpose of my book to come up with tools that you can use to navigate toxic leadership, or even better, to not maybe become a target of the toxic leader if you realize he's toxic, because they are not necessarily toxic to every single one of their employees, but there's always a strategic background who they treat how. And yes, then, and this is very important, and that is why I love the title of your book, Laura, so much. I wish I'd quit sooner, because this is such an essential truth. Because as a matter of fact, you cannot fight toxic leadership forever. You can survive as good as possible without getting sick, hopefully. That's our wish for everyone that comes into a situation where I've been. And when you have the right toolkit, when you know what to do, for example, then you can survive in a more or less good way until you find a new job, or until the boss maybe is going to retire, if that time is near. But you will never be able to really change the toxic boss. And the chances that a toxic environment changes before it consumes you are rather low. So don't regret quitting earlier. Or quitting doesn't necessarily mean to leave the company. It can also mean to find a different position in the organization. That's something that worked for me, for example, perfectly. Through the help of HR back then, I could come back from my sick leave and finally start working in a company that, in a division that I was already familiar to before the reorganization that I mentioned earlier, and I'm reporting to a genuinely great boss now and have a great team. And lastly, then I'm finished here. Also, a very personal experience is the importance of letting go. Because I remember when I started writing the book, I had the idea in my head that one day I will hand over a copy of my book to my former boss, and that would kind of be like the ultimate triumph for me. But the deeper I got into the research and also reflection, the more that urge faded. And because once you understand that toxic leaders also are toxic because they have certain personality traits like narcissism, Machiavellianism, or even psychopathy, you realize that toxic leaders on the inside might be really deeply insecure and sometimes struggling with serious psychological issues themselves. And while I don't want to see that as an excuse for how people are treated, I think it helps to move on and instead to clinging to the past. And that shift in perspective was really liberating for me.
Well, that is a very good perspective because I think it is healthier to release and to understand that they are unlikely to change, but they're on their own journey and they do have deep psychological trauma typically that's unresolved. And so I'm just sorry you went through that, but really good reflections. So I really want to turn attention towards moving forward. So how can we reinvent leadership? And why is it so broken in organizations today? So I'll give this question to you, Paul.
A broad question, one which consumes my pretty much every waking hour at the moment, for the last 8 years. Marcus, again, thank you for explaining some of the stuff on that you mentioned just now, especially around um, the idea of letting go, because I think the idea of letting go isn't just at the individual level. So, in order to answer this question that you've asked around reinventing leadership, Laura, I think we have to let go at many different levels in the organization. So the organization we design organizations, humans design organizations, and for some reason, we've got it into our heads that we can't redesign them, that we have to accept the way things are. We have to play the political game. We can't be real. We can't be authentic. We can't ask questions for fear of upsetting our bosses. Actually, we can. So there's a whole trend and movement showing that we're redesigning organizational structures to align better with purpose, with purpose over profit, with creating the kind of environment that we want to work and live and lead within. So there are lots of examples that are out there that are showing we have to redesign the system before we can redesign and reinvent leadership, and then both of them are in parallel. So part of that means we have to let go of things that didn't work at that systemic level in the organization and our approach to leadership. And I think about why I'm motivated to do this work, and it's because of the next generation of leaders that don't want this. They've been very clear they don't want the way it's been done, and they will choose to with their feet to not join organizations. So I'm connecting the dots years before a lot of other organizations and thought leaders have, because I'm saying we know that the future generations don't want the way we've done it. So how can we involve them and include them in the conversations to help design those future organizational structures and their future approaches to leadership? So, I've like you, Marcus, I've developed different tool sets and frameworks, and one such tool is, it sounds very simple, but it's a toxicity BHAG. Create a big, hairy, audacious goal. Jim Collins' work from Good to Great, but actually get organizations and leadership at senior levels committed to what their BHAG is around this area. And in the classic world of transformation and change and how this all works, we know that if senior leadership are aligned on something, then it starts to trickle through the organization, and there's empowerment at every level, et cetera, et cetera. That's one thing that can work really well. But I think, um, specifically, to reinvent the way we do leadership, we need to create the conditions to have honest conversations. And Amy Edmondson talks about that in her work around psychological safety. Timothy Clark does the same at Leader Factor. But some of the things they're missing is the fact, well, the one thing they're missing is the fact that until we stop penalizing honesty and realness as things that we shouldn't be, and encouraging them and bringing them into the way that we interact, I believe that we're just, how do I put this in a polite way? We're putting a different shade of lipstick on the same pig. And until we create the environment, the foundation, and I don't mean, hey, bring your dog to work on a Friday or play foosball or play with the beanbags and have beer in the fridge. I don't mean that kind of culture. I mean the kind of culture that says there's 15 of us in a room and around a boardroom. The boss says to you, hey, Laura, hey, Marcus, what do you think of this idea? I want your honest opinion. And then you two give an opinion that's a safe answer, for fear of all that muscle memory in your synapse around what work should be like and what happens when you're real and honest. Until we change that, everything we're talking about, Laura, around reinventing leadership and shifting the structure of how we work, it's a paper. I'm full of analogies today. It's like a sandcastle built on a lack of a foundation. Until we do the work to actually have that conversation, and that starts at the individual level, starts at the team level, starts at the organization level, starts at the industry level. And I know it's happening because I've talked to people where they're starting to become more self-reflective. Until we normalize that, then everything we're doing with our crusades and our quests is wonderful. But I want this to take off like wildfire. I want people to normalize this kind of conversation and not be fearful of speaking the truth for fear of being penalized. And I think that's the elephant in the room. That's what a lot of people do with all these initiatives, all these agendas, all these ideas that we talked about earlier. And there's more going on now than has ever gone on in the world of this stuff. We're still not getting to the heart of it. And I think it's really simple.
It's honesty like our parents would have taught us, right? Honesty is the best policy in those sorts of statements. I mean, they hold truth, but you learn how to, honesty can get you in trouble when you're in a toxic environment, right? Where you fear making a mistake. You fear having an idea that your boss will shoot down. You fear maybe reporting a toxic boss or mentioning it even to HR because you don't trust the fabric of the organization will protect you.
I'll just throw one other thing in there and then I'll hand it back over to you, Laura, for reflections and follow up. I'm listening to an audiobook at the moment by Ariana Huffington, Thrive. And in it, she's talking about a different metric to measure the effectiveness of individuals and leaders and organizational success. It's an interesting book in its own right, but one of the things that really has touched me so far is what I'm calling the eulogy test. And this is simply the following. When you die, and we'll all die, when we die, will people that are giving a eulogy about you say, hey, Marcus was the kind of guy that stayed late every night and he did everything to get that promotion and he treated clients really well and he went over and above? No. They're going to say how much they loved you. They're going to say what impact you had on their lives. So I apply this in the same sense of this whole discussion, Laura. It's like, let's think about what future leaders are going to say about the organizations that they worked in and led in, right? What are they going to say right now around a toxic culture? And what do we want them to say? And so I implore every leader out there listening to this, or every person listening to this that's contributing to this challenge, how do you help that eulogy be something that's memorable and something that you're proud of mentioning? Because I think we've got the metrics all wrong. And again, Ariana talks about that in her book, but it as part of my work in this area, I've been playing around with this idea of, well, what would you like people to say about you at the organization that you were leading? And what would you like people to say about the organization that you were part of? So that's an interesting proposition to get people thinking differently.
I love that. That's super interesting. And when I ask in my keynotes, I'll ask, what was the best leader you ever worked for? How would you describe them? And people always say they were compassionate, they were caring, they helped me, they supported me. It's all of these soft skills, these caring skills. So the environment that cares for the human being that is part of the worker is the workplace that you would talk about in a eulogy proudly. And the leader you'd want to be proudly that impacted people, their development, their well-being, and people will go to the ends of the earth for leaders like that.
And so to full circle that to the title of this discussion, why toxic bosses stay while good leaders get fired. You, until we shift the idea of that we've normalized political game playing and jockeying for power and all of that, until we've shifted that, we it will be really difficult for us to see at individual team and leadership and industry level the kinds of leaders with the leadership qualities that we need for the future to eradicate such toxicity, right? So until we start seeing them differently, we will still see them as irritants. My own example, case in point, I was driven by every single organization I worked with to help them at a bigger level, the bigger picture. But because I stepped on leadership landmines, I was I was different than everybody else. And again, I'm my experience is my experience, and I'm actually I talk honestly about and openly about my experience because I want others to be able to do similar. Um, but I think it's that piece that we need to shift our understanding of those kinds of leadership qualities, because ironically they are what we need to help eradicate toxic culture, dysfunction, and prepare ourselves for what's coming in disruption. So we haven't even talked about that, but the way we do organizations today isn't going to prepare us for what's coming ahead.
Yes, very well put. So, to add to that, Marcus, do you have any final thoughts on eradicating toxic leadership from your perspective?
Well, first, I really like your analogy. That's very inspiring. And what you said about speaking your mind in a toxic workplace reminds me just a very brief story of a former boss of mine, and I didn't even consider him toxic at the time. He would always say, well, he prefers employees that speak their mind and that are not yes men, and because only that way you can learn and develop further. But if you did, and it didn't matter whether you turned out to be right at the end, it didn't go down very well if you spoke your mind and contradicted or challenged his opinion. So that's about that. Eradicating toxic leadership. I think, from my view, the first thing would be that organizations actually start to actually care about toxic leadership, because in too many cases I have the feeling that this is actually not the case. But if you want a healthy, or if you want healthy, productive, innovative, and truly loyal employees, organizations will have to face the reality and honestly commit to change. And that means identifying toxic hotspots in an organization, removing toxic leaders responsible, and steadily building a work culture that has zero tolerance for any sort of toxicity. And when I was also working in HR for a while, and I had the honor, and I really like that, to do exit talks with employees that decided to leave the organization. And while this gives you a lot of clues, like about what went wrong and why they left, and because they finally can speak openly, I would really love to foster the idea of stay interviews in addition to exit talks. Hire people and ask them 4 weeks later, 2 months later, half a year later, how they are doing, how their expectations they had, are they being met by the organization, or are they struggling? Because then you maybe would be able to keep these people that would otherwise drop out, either because they break or because they say, uh, sorry guys, I'm not doing this for you. And so you would not lose these people maybe, and those could be the ones that later are those good leaders, ethical leaders that have actually those skills and personalities that we want in leadership positions.
It's interesting, and again, I can drop a sample of this in as a follow-up, Laura, as well, if people are interested. There's a section in my book called The 13 Unlucky Steps to Leadership Identification, Recruitment, Onboarding and Development. And Markus, when you were talking about stay interviews, it just reminded me of a section in that chapter about onboarding and the state of onboarding today. And there's an example with Spotify that talks about what would get you to stay in this role already. So if you haven't connected with that case study, I can definitely put it your way. But I guess, Laura, again, that provides almost a blueprint for, if we're going to eradicate toxic leadership, we need to first start looking at our own house, to review our own house, what's not working, what's working, and then look at, okay, let's audit what's working well, what's not working well. That's the foundation for anyone out there thinking, what do I do next? I've heard this podcast, there's some great ideas. Audit your house, get your house in order, see what needs to evolve, and that's what's really going to help you identify those toxic hotspots as well.
Ask the questions and be curious and caring about the answers.
Mm.
So be curious and caring. I think we don't do enough of that because we're so rushed and there's so much on our plates and we're so busy and we ostrich. I think a lot of leaders don't want to know the answer to this necessarily. If they have a disengaged workforce, if they have a bunch of people thinking of leaving, it's tough. That's really tough news. And it's easier to put your head in the sand sometimes. So I would encourage leaders not to ostrich, to keep your head high, but your mind open and your heart open to getting to the bottom of this and creating a healthy culture where people will speak about it at your funeral, that you were a great leader and you showed compassion, you cared, and you grew a great organization with people that thrived. So that's what we want them to be saying about you. And my final question as we wrap up here for each of you, and I ask all my guests this, is what's one wish for a better world when it comes to leadership today? So we'll start with you, Markus.
You could wish for a lot of things, but I really wish that executives would realize what tremendous damage toxic work environments and especially toxic leaders are causing to their organization, especially financially, and how much they could benefit from honestly facing that issue. I think if that would be in the mind of those in power or those making the decisions, the issue of toxic leadership would soon not be that big of an issue anymore.
Wonderful. Thank you, Markus. Really well put. And now on to you, Paul.
I would like all leaders to be open to understanding their own blind spots as a leader. Because I think if we understand our blind spots, we can look into the dark corners of the room to get more curious about, okay, what's showing up? So if I'm a toxic leader, um, am I aware of it? I mean, this is a whole other thing. Am I aware of it? Am I not aware of it? Have I ever done the work, the reflection, and have I ever asked myself the questions? Have I got curious about myself? So I would want every leader to get curious about themselves and be open to looking at their blind spots, because I think a lot of the answers for all of these issues that we've talked about could lie there in that work. So self-reflection, self-awareness, and openness to it.
Wonderful. Really well put. And I really hope these wishes come true in 2026. No, I think it's going to take longer than that. But we're all on this mission together. I have all 3 of our books sitting on my desk, and they're all these, all shades of blue in our books, actually, as well as bright colors. We all have that in common because I think we have some optimism and some brightness around an otherwise dark topic. So thank you for both being on this journey as collaborators and colleagues and people I admire and respect. This has been a great conversation, and I hope you both really stay well.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Laura. Thanks for having us.
My pleasure. Take care. Thank you for tuning in to Where Work Meets Life. If you found this content valuable, please rate, review, and share with others who may benefit. If you're struggling in your work life and need support, I offer coaching sessions. You can book a complimentary consult on my website. I'm also a passionate keynote speaker and would love to discuss your professional speaking needs. Visit my website, drlaura.live, to sign up for my monthly e-newsletter filled with tips and resources to help you stay well.